Did you know that Gorée Island in Senegal was referred to as the door of no return? Over 20 million people passed through that tiny island, never to return home. Or that Haiti's revolution was directly influenced by the revolt of enslaved Africans in the French Caribbean, inspired by the struggles of those in Africa? Did you know that a Dutch trader named Hendrik Hertog, also known as Yovo Huntukonu, established a trading post in Badagry, also known as Vlekete slave market? Hertog bought land from the local people and made the town a trading post. And here's something to think about. Why did African kingdoms, despite knowing the horrors of the trade, continue to trade their people? Was it survival, or were there other motives? Africa, mother of civilization, cradle of history, yet a dark chapter in its past shadows its magnificent heritage. The Atlantic slave trade, spanning centuries, tore apart families, cultures, and communities. But what role did Africa play in this devastating trade? Was Africa just a victim, or did it contribute in ways we may not fully understand? Today we dive into Africa's role, its resistance, and its legacy in the Atlantic slave trade. From the 16th to the 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade forcibly transported 12 to 13 million Africans across the ocean to the Americas. But Africa's involvement wasn't just as a victim. In many cases, African states, kingdoms, and empires played a significant role. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade by David Eltis and James Walvin and Slave Trade and Abolition in the Atlantic World by Seymour Drescher, the slave trade touched many parts of Africa. But records show that the following states were the most affected: Ghana, formerly the Gold Coast; Benin, formerly Dahomey; Nigeria, particularly the Yoruba and Ibibio regions; Senegal, including the infamous Gorée Island; Angola, the Congo, Liberia, and Mozambique. Not all African states participated willingly in the trade. In fact, many fought against it, sometimes at great cost. Let's talk about the brave African leaders who resisted. King Jezo of Dahomey fiercely opposed European slave traders. However, despite his efforts, Dahomey's economy became increasingly reliant on the trade. But he wasn't the only one. In West Africa, Samori Touré, leader of the Mandinka Empire, waged wars against the French and other European powers to halt the slave trade in the region. His resistance delayed colonial domination for several decades. The Zulu kingdom also resisted British encroachment, with figures like Shaka Zulu fighting against both the slave trade and colonial influence. But the eventual outcome? Though these kingdoms resisted, the impact of European military technology and the overwhelming demand for slaves left them vulnerable. But not every African kingdom resisted. Some capitalized on the slave trade, trading their people for European goods like firearms, textiles, and rum. The Ashanti Empire of modern-day Ghana played a major role in the slave trade. King Osei Tutu in the 18th century forged alliances with European slave traders, exchanging captives for European arms. This trade fueled the Ashanti's military power and expansion, but also tore apart the social fabric of their communities. In Benin, the Kingdom of Dahomey was heavily involved in the trade, establishing a significant slave port at Ouida. The demand for slaves in the Americas led to an increase in local wars and human trafficking. The slave trade didn't just cause tension between African states and Europeans, it sparked devastating conflicts among African societies themselves. According to Africa and the Slave Trade by Hugh Thomas, and Africa's Legacy in the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Eric Williams, slave traders paid for captives with firearms, and African kingdoms engaged in bloody intertribal warfare. The Yoruba and Benin kingdoms clashed, with the Yoruba expanding their territory at the expense of neighboring tribes, contributing to the large-scale raids that brought victims to the coastal slave markets. If this video made you think about Africa's role in the slave trade in a new way, share it with another African. Let's continue to educate ourselves about our history, understand its impact, and acknowledge how it shapes us today. And don't forget to stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore the African diaspora's journey to the Americas, the cultural rebirth that followed, and the eventual abolition of the slave trade. Have you ever wondered how African music and culture survived the brutality of the slave trade? Or what happened when African traditions merged with American and European cultures? What was the genesis of the journey to the end of the slave trade? Find out in part 2.